So I mentioned before, a risk assessment needs to consider three main things. It needs to consider threats, vulnerabilities or gaps or weaknesses, and it needs to consider consequences. So in order to conduct a risk assessment properly, you need to have that information. So you need to have good network architecture diagrams and understanding how the network's architected and segmented and how information is flowing and how endpoints are secured. So we call that a cyber architecture design review. And it's the first step in this kind of three-step or 3D assessment model. The second step is the maturity or the compliance gap assessment. This is what is probably the most common thing that's done in industry is companies will either themselves or they're bringing a consultant and they'll do a maturity or gap assessment. And that is basically taking a standard, a reference standard like NIST CSF or 62443 or the company standards and going through and evaluating the level of maturity of the organization and compliance of sites against those benchmark standards. They add value, certainly, to identifying these gaps, both technical and administrative. But it's very important to note that they do not tell you anything about risk. They just tell you about lack of maturity or lack of compliance. So where the rubber meets the road really is in the third part, the consequence-based risk assessment, where all of that comes together, and you look at the system, and you look at what are the realistic threats, what are the known vulnerabilities and gaps, and then most importantly, what are the consequences? So what? So what if this system is compromised? What would actually happen operationally? And do we have other safeguards in place that might prevent that? And then where do we not have enough defenses? Where do we not have enough barriers?
I think the key thing to remember back there, it's very similar to a HAZOP, right? You wouldn't do a HAZOP or you wouldn't do a process hazard analysis without a P&ID, pipe specs, and heat material balance. You also would want to know the maturity of who's going to repair and engineer and design and what your standards are for building it. And then you would go through the consequences. But to start with nothing and jump into just the consequence-based or the maturity, you don't have a full picture. Just like a HAZOP, you would not have a full picture without those other things to support it.
Yeah, so we always recommend doing the risk assessment last, after you have that information. Now, of course, you may already have the information, then you could just jump in, just do the risk assessment. Maybe you've already done a gap assessment. Maybe you've already done a CATER. In our view, all three are important, and the sequence is actually also quite important.